and welcome to another episode of Coast Connections. On this episode today, we're connecting with all the good people at Ducks Unlimited Canada and here in BC as well, and to find out the amazing work that they're doing to protect our wetlands and the amazing biodiversity of wildlife that live in our wetlands, and what the threats are, what the projects that they have going on are to protect them, and why they're so important, and also what you can do to get involved to support this good work. Celebrating 85 years here is Ducks Unlimited Canada with our two guests that we have today. Sarah Nathan, welcome to Sarah, to Coast Connections, and your colleague Matthew Christensen. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you both on screen. And just before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the traditional territory, the unceded territory of the Sineemuk First Nation here in Nanaimo, BC, where we have the privilege of living and working. And with that, well, let's get started and meet the ducks. Now, Sarah, this was established in 1938, so you folks are celebrating your 85th anniversary this year. Tell us a little bit about how Ducks Unlimited got started and what the reason was that it came into existence.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So like you said, we're celebrating our 85th anniversary this year. We're one of the largest and longest standing conservation organizations in North America. It's pretty exciting to be 85 years old. We've accomplished a fair bit in those 85 years, especially the conservation and restoration of more than 6.2 million acres of natural habitat across the country. That's at over 12,000 project sites. In BC, what we have on the ground here is 183,000 hectares of wetland and associated upland habitats that we've conserved or restored via 580 different habitat projects. About 70,000 hectares of that is actual wetland, and the remainder is associated upland. So often you have forest area immediately upland of that provides nesting space for cavity nesting ducks. And sometimes it's within agricultural landscapes where grasslands also provide really important nesting areas for other species too. Mm-hmm. So we're really excited to share with you that the Government of Canada, through its Historic Sites and Monuments Board, acknowledged us, Ducks Unlimited, as a national significant, an organization of national significance. So they select those deemed for that designation as having shaped our country and illustrate the defining moments of who we are. So we're really proud to have had that designation. And we're actually the only national conservation organization to be recognized that way.
Mm-hmm. Congratulations on that. And I believe that just happened last year. Is that correct, Matthew?
Yeah, exactly. And just to kind of, I guess, add on to what Sarah was saying about, when we came to be and why we were established. So we were established in 1938. During the Great Depression, the North American plains were, experiencing a drought. And as a result, there was this decline in waterfowl populations. And so these conservationists banded together and tried to come up with ways to restore these wetlands, to support these waterfowl populations. And as a result, DUC today, or Ducks Unlimited Canada, is active from coast to coast and really advocating the importance of conserving wetlands for a variety of important environmental reasons, including habitat for ducks, but also mitigating climate change and addressing climate impacts. Ducks Unlimited Canada itself I see it as a universal convener. We bring together the boots on the ground agricultural producers, the hunters, the naturalists, all levels of government, and we look to find solutions that are based in science and really bring together those values that we all have and try to find those solutions that will kind of bring us together forward for both ecosystems as well as society.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And what actually defines a wetland as opposed to a lake or an ocean? What exactly is the difference between a wetland and other bodies of water?
Yeah, sure. So wetlands are known as a transitional ecosystem. So it's sort of an area where terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems are transitioning together, typically characterized by soils that are wetted for most of the year. And then there's certain plants that tend to occur in these types of areas as well that can help identify a wetland. there's a bunch of different types of wetlands. There's bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, shallow open water, and then also estuarine wetlands. So the estuary has the distinction of being another type of transition as well, where it's transitioning from fresh to salt water. So, in Nanaimo, there's the Nanaimo estuary, and there's a number of other estuaries all along the east coast of Vancouver Island where that's going on. And then another really big, important estuary is the Fraser Delta as well. So that's basically what a wetland is, and I'd love to share with you why we think wetlands are so important. So,
I'd love to hear that.
yeah, it's a bit of a laundry list. So, because there's just so many reasons for why wetlands should be conserved and restored, and for why I'm really glad I get to do this work. Wetlands, they're really important green natural infrastructure. So the dense plants that occur there act as filters. So they can actually trap pollution and settle it out and bind it as water is passing through. So they help to reduce pollutant levels in water. They absorb excess water during floods, and especially in an estuary, you get these nice dense marsh plants in certain areas that can attenuate waves, which really helps reduce risks of big storm surges and king tides and frankly sea level rise. It helps to protect communities against all those things. Obviously, wetland is water on the landscape, so it really helps to buffer against drought. In particular, it's those really saturated soils that can really hang on to water for a long time. And so all of that saturated soil and green vegetation and the water itself, a big thing there is it's a fire break. So in wildfire season, our friends that ranch that work with us and that partner with us on the landscape always say, yeah, no, it was my wet areas, so those wetlands that I have and my hay fields that didn't burn, whereas drier forested habitat with more coniferous vegetation is what ignites and goes up. Wetlands, again, in the soils as well as the plants, really store carbon, so they can lock up carbon. And in particular, estuaries are very excellent because the chemistry is a bit different there. So there's a little bit less emissions back into the air via decay than there are in freshwater wetlands. So your estuaries are really an excellent spot to fight climate change by carbon absorption. And then, of course, biodiversity. So there's a huge number of critters that use wetlands for at least some part of their life cycle. In fact, 40% of the world's species actually are fairly dependent on wetland and freshwater aquatic ecosystems. So that's a really big deal. And so these are really great systems to focus on for all those reasons. Of course, conservation is so important in wetlands because they also tend to occur where people like to set up shop. So in your valley bottoms, like where rich soils, are there likely because of wetlands and rivers depositing sediment and accumulation, makes for great crop growing. So people tend to settle there. There's, in terms of port areas, so a big port city, Vancouver, set up there right in a wetland area because that's where you can move goods in and out up the Fraser River. So these are places that tend to be colonized by humans. Easy to colonize a low-level flat place rather than a steep hilly one. So therefore, these tend to be at risk. And in the more populated parts of the province, we've developed into human-based infrastructure of like 80 to 85% of our wetlands. So that's especially true in the Fraser Delta, Vancouver Island, the east coast of Vancouver Island especially, and the Okanagan are kind of the real hot areas. Of course, for Ducks Unlimited, like about 1.5 million waterfowl breed in the interior, and about 8 million waterfowl depend on our coastal areas to get them the food they need to get to their nesting areas, be it in the BC interior or further up in the boreal forest. So so those are all, some good reasons to love and protect wetlands.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Sarah. And Matthew, what are some of the bigger threats to our wetlands? Because we have lost a lot of our wetlands in the last even 20 years, haven't we? And I think Canada has 25% of the world's existing wetlands right now, I think that is. Tell us about some of the threats to wetlands and what you're trying to do to mitigate that.
Yeah, for sure. So currently the world's faced with like the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. And
right.
Climate change is definitely impacting wetlands, and like we have these new scenarios around precipitation and drought that are, maybe changing the water level and the availability of those wetlands on the landscape. And then that's compounded by the pressures that humans are placing on the landscape, whether it be through urban sprawl, or land development, land use change. And these are some of the primary threats: pollution coming into these wetlands. But they're also, as much as they're a threat, they're an opportunity for us to mitigate and combat climate change. So wetlands provide an immense opportunity to both attenuate, stormwater and rainwater extreme events, but also modulate the local climate and provide some of that buffer around like fire suppression and things like that. So depending on where you are in the landscape, if we take BC for an example, we see intense kind of development pressures in the Fraser Delta related to land use prices. Land is so expensive here that people want to maximize the use of any little bit that they can for the benefit that's achievable. In the interior, that we'll see, in valley bottoms, we'll see oftentimes wetlands are drained for agricultural production, or we'll see kind of more cattle grazing into these riparian areas that are sensitive. But we're trying to work with these different user groups to identify solutions that are both going to help them in the long term, help nature, as well as combat and address climate change.
Mm-hmm. Now we have an interesting photo that you've shared with us today. It's a bulldozer with a bunch of culverts. Tell us a bit about what's happening with this activity that you're doing with some of your field work.
For sure. So for ducks, like how we started and of what we've done largely on the landscape across North America is trying to restore or recreate those natural wetlands that were in place before. So to do that, these wetlands might have been drained to support agriculture or whatever development was needed. And so what we can do is we will go in with a team of engineers and biologists, and we'll say, hey, this wetland likely used to look like this. We want to support kind of these sort of waterfowl population objectives and habitat values. And to do that, if we install some culverts and some concrete, we can kind of manage or augment to try and recreate those natural processes that used to be on the landscape. Mm-hmm. And so here we're putting in some culverts that will facilitate that flow to allow to manage those water levels based on current climatic conditions as well as hopefully future climatic conditions.
Now, some of the diverse species that you're trying to attract to these, let's say, artificially made wetlands, does it take a while for them to adapt to this? Does they go, oh, come on, this isn't the real thing? Or do they take to it like a duck to water?
I mean, in many cases, it literally is a duck to water. So there's that. That's a very interesting question, and it's one that we're getting more and more curious about. And I'm going to just segue right into a quick conversation about beavers. So one of the main drivers of wetland loss in North America, especially Western North America, it seems like, was the fur trade. So beavers were out in the landscape, in pre-contact, making wetlands and sort of managing those types of ecosystems. And it's actually amazing how, if you really get into the literature on this, how many beavers were lost and how much wetland loss occurred as a result of that. So, when we talk about origin stories of, noticing ducks in little dried up puddles during the Dust Bowl of the Depression, part of what led up to that in many parts of the continent really was loss of beavers. And so we're contemplating at this point, because we have a number of our sort of engineered wetlands that are out on the landscape that do have beavers kind of hanging around and building their beaver dam on top of our dam and causing us, some heartache with the dam safety regulators and all of that kind of stuff. So we're in the process of trying to figure out how we can work more with beavers. And one of the things we're wondering about is, are the wetlands, is there a biodiversity difference between the wetlands that beavers manage versus the ones that we manage? We're in the process of trying to set up some experiments to figure that out, which would be really cool. And then I think the other thing will be, in parts of the landscape that can have a bit more of a dynamic wetland system on them, i.e. places where there isn't maybe a road right adjacent or a landowner who really needs to know that there isn't going to be a flush of water across their yard one day. Those might be areas where we can encourage beavers. So this is, we're kind of embarking on a bit of a learning piece there. And so I'd love to be able to answer that question with a bit more information in the future. But as what we do know is that the projects that we've engineered on the landscape really are full of biodiversity. You basically can't go to one and not find, a couple of species of frogs at least. And, we do a lot of waterfowl surveys and some other songbird work showing that, in fact, they are extremely biodiverse with a lot of abundant species as well.
Mm-hmm. When I was researching the show and looking up a bit more about beavers, it was really interesting that the average beaver lodge or beaver dam is about 100 meters, and the largest one in Canada is at Wood Buffalo National Park in Alberta, and it's 800 meters big, and you can actually see it from space. The astronaut Chris Hadfield actually noticed that too. So that is one big dam. So, Matthew, what's the difference between a dam and a lodge when it comes to beavers?
Beavers will build a dam to control their habitat, so to control the water level, to give themselves some safety from predators, and as well to encourage vegetation that they like to eat. Their lodge is the actual thing that they live in. So if you're at a beaver affected area, you will probably see a beaver dam and also a lodge. So the lodge will look like, it's somewhere in the middle of the pond, and it's like this big lump, like a cone almost of mud and sticks just kind of sticking out like a pile of stuff. Whereas the dam is, it's probably linear, and it's also muck and branches and all that kind of thing, but it's kind of got a linear, form, and like the one you can see from space at Wood Buffalo, and it holds water back.
I remember, like, as a kid, we went on a field trip and they took us to the IMAX theater in Edmonton. I'm from Alberta. They showed this beaver film, and it was such this immersive experience. And I think that for me was like the triggering moment for like wanting to get into this field, and then having it be full circle now, where we're chartering new territory around, reestablishing beavers and working with them to achieve our objectives. It's quite,
And also I learned that in their lodge, it's sort of two parts. There's the part where they come in sort of the wet room, where they come in when they're wet, and then they sort of dry off a bit and then go into the main living area. So they they're pretty good housekeepers. And I also read that sometimes muskrats will live with beavers as well. So they're rather social. If I had a nickel for every beaver that I saw, I wouldn't have very much money. We don't have too many beavers left around here.
Let's talk. You're seeing them on your nipples, maybe.
Exactly. Let's talk about some of the invasive species work that you're doing and some of the field work that you do, tagging ducks and removing some of the invasive plants.
For sure. Yeah. So it's Invasive Species Week. We're currently working on a large campaign to kind of promote the awareness of invasive species, the threats that they place on biodiversity, and kind of what Ducks Unlimited is doing in that realm. One of our very successful programs is the invasive Spartina program. So Spartina is an invasive intertidal grass. There's 4 species that are recognized as provincially noxious weeds, and they're part of the early detection rapid response program that the province has set up. So Ducks Unlimited's role is to chair the BC Spartina Working Group, which convenes local government, other NGOs, provincial government, and the federal government to try and address this threat. And so this species, what it'll do is it'll come in and it'll displace these natural estuarine areas, which are really important biodiversity areas, particularly for waterfowl. On the Pacific coast, we have the highest density of wintering waterfowl in Canada. And if they lose that habitat, they don't have a place to have that overwintering area to like stock up on food. So since around 2003, 2004, Ducks has been working with all of these partners to try and detect all the locations, determine the extent of the problem, and implement solutions to kind of try and reduce that population, get it under control, and make sure that those habitat values are protected. And so since that time, we had kind of peak population levels of these species around 2016, and we've actually reduced the population of some of these species by 95% and their aerial extent, or the locations which they're found, by 65%. So this is huge progress, and obviously it's an ongoing long-term issue. These don't know borders. They tend to just kind of do their own thing, and so it's a matter of like keeping everyone connected and collaborating and continuing to work to eradicate those species.
And as you say, you're partnering with partners across North America as well, because these migration patterns are huge for some of these waterfowl as well. And also with Indigenous peoples as well, to learn from the traditional knowledge that they've been implementing for thousands of years as well, that we can adapt and learn from some of their practices as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. So through this Sportana program in particular, as an example, we have a team of crews that are from the Stolo Nation that come and support. We've worked with Tsawwassen First Nation and Comox First Nation as well to implement these different mapping and treatment methods. And definitely, they're the ones that are on the ground. They know the landscape, and they've been a huge resource and a critical part of accomplishing what we've accomplished so far.
Very good. And Sarah, if viewers want to get involved or volunteer or even just take measures at home, how can they support the work that you're doing? What are some of the volunteer opportunities or things that we could just do every day that would actually support the wetlands health?
Oh, yeah. There's lots of things. I mean, in terms of volunteering with Ducks Unlimited, we have over 3,900 volunteers across the country, and about 480 or so folks in British Columbia volunteer with us. And there's a couple of different things you can do as a volunteer. So volunteers raise awareness and they raise funds for wetland conservation in their communities. So a really kind of traditional Ducks Unlimited volunteer activity is sort of hosting fundraising dinners and auctions. We're also in the process of developing sort of a newer volunteer program in BC, in particular, called Marsh Keepers. So the role of a marsh keeper is to assist in a DUC project by doing some site inspections. So, the focus, depending on, the desire of the marsh keeper, might be doing some bird counts, noticing invasive plants, helping to care for any engineered infrastructure that we might have at the site. Mm-hmm. And sort of reporting back to us via some apps that we've put together for folks to use in the field. Volunteers come to an agency for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are purely social. Some of them are, I want to learn more about what you're doing and consider, younger folks might want to consider careers in conservation. So there's opportunities for some learning. And so we have on our ducks.ca website, we have ducks.ca/volunteer, where you can kind of navigate through and find those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, what's one of the more rewarding aspects of the work that you do and why you do it?
Oh, I think there's a few points. I think the first point that really hooked me into Ducks Unlimited was with the Sportana program, the on the ground, tangible, like seeing this plant kind of expand, and then our efforts actually contracted and have that really meaningful impact on restoration and restoration of habitat. And then I think the other part that's really rewarding is like every day at Ducks is quite challenging, and I work a different part of my brain. It's very complex work. As I said before, it's convening all of these different values, using science and trying to drive forward a solution. That's for me, like what's the real hook and what's really rewarding about working here.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, same question for you.
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of the same things, but I guess some of the different things that Matt didn't mention that stand out for me. One of them is applied science. I love to set up partnerships with universities and get a student working on a question for us so that we can learn more and do better on the landscape. So some of the learning we're doing about beavers really is coming from there, as well as with a collaboration with New Chalmouth Tribal Council. And so that learning, with landscape ecology and ecological restoration expertise from outside, and then getting to apply that and seeing results is really huge for me. And I love coaching staff. I love we've hired a bunch of new staff. We've had a funding uptick over the last few years, and it's been a real pleasure to get to work with all those new people. And lastly, I get to talk to a really wide range of people. Ranchers, yourself, ministers, educators, the general public. So it's just a really nice, diverse job. I really love the big tent convening role that we get to play on the landscape. It's a lot of fun for me.
Very good. Matthew, what's your favorite waterfowl species? Do you have a favorite duck?
Canvasback. I know it's like not super big in BC, but like they're big. They're kind of like red and beautiful duck. Yeah.
And what would be the migration distance for a canvasback? How far do these? ducks fly?
Anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 miles. I don't know specifically for canvasback, but I know, like a brant will do 3,000 miles, and like a pintail will do 2,000 miles. And typically those migration corridors from the east to the west coast are they're not hugely different. Yeah.
And of course, they use these wetlands for resting, for nesting, for feeding, for breeding, all of those important things. So, we need to preserve that canvasback duck of yours. Which you're doing.
Trying, yes.
Yeah. Same question to you, Sarah. A favorite duck, favorite waterfowl, favorite dragonfly?
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. So I'd say my favorite duck is, it's a toss-up. I'm gonna go ruddy duck though today. They're just so funny. You don't see them very often on the coast, but a fair bit we see them in the Caribou, like up in the Williams Lake area. They make me laugh. The males do this funny little breeding display where they blow bubbles and just sit really upright and puff out their chests, and I just find it hilarious. So I'd go with ruddy duck.
And are they also coming from the far Arctic to nest down here, or do they fly south in the winter?
So they would fly south. So they're common nesters sort of in interior BC and sort of up into the boreal a little bit, but they're not an Arctic bird. And they do a similar kind of continental migration route as Matt described.
Yeah. And on your website too, I noticed that you're doing some really interesting work with dragonflies, one of the smaller species that inhabit the wetlands. And I was amazed to learn that they're 300 million years old, these dragonflies and damselflies, one of the older species on the planet. So, and their migration patterns are sort of multi-generational. It'll take many generations of a dragonfly to make its cycle. So thank you so much. I'm just going to have you each give some closing thoughts here. Over to you, Matthew, just before we wrap up. We just have a few minutes left.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time to articulate, what we do and why we're so passionate about what we do. I'd just like to highlight that, ducks in North America are one of the species that are not as at threat as other birds, and that's largely as a result of good wetland policy and legislation to support wetland protection. And so we hope that we can expand this model for other conservation for both other wildlife and other habitats.
Mm-hmm. Very important. Thank you, Matthew. Sarah.
I like to highlight that we are 85 years old, so Ducks Unlimited has some staying power. We're not a flash in the pan, and I hope we have another at least 85 more years of good conservation work. I love the wetland-oriented work, and there's just so many species that depend on or at least benefit from wetlands that waterfowl conservation in this regard it's really just species and biodiversity conservation. So it's just such a pleasure to get to talk about that today. Thanks so much for having us.
You're very welcome. Thank you both, Matthew Christensen, Sarah Nathan from Ducks Unlimited. We wish you all the best out there in the field. Stay safe, and we look forward to having you back sometime in the next 85 years. Thanks to you both. And thank you for joining us on Coast Connections. And check out their website, ducks.ca. There's all kinds of really interesting information on there. And you might find some really good volunteer opportunities for yourself that'll fit the bill for you. And learn that Ducks Unlimited is actually everything it's quacked up to be. Sorry. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Coast Connections.